Greetings gamers, it's been about 3 months since the mapping software Wonderdraft first came into public beta, and now it is set to leave very soon. The beta for version 1.0, the official launch version, is now available. I'm going to spend some time today running you through just how to use Wonderdraft as a piece of mapping software and cover all of its features. Before we dive into this tutorial, I just want to make a really quick disclaimer. This isn't going to be a video on how to make a good looking map. This is purely a video on how to use Wonderdraft, where the different tools are and how the different tools work. If you want a video on how to make a map, I've already done one of those, which you can find in the description or in the card. But for this video, I'm just showing you, if you're someone brand new to Wonderdraft, you've just downloaded the program, this video will show you what to click, where the different options are, and how to use the different options. But with that all said, let's dive straight in and get map making. So diving right in, once you've downloaded Wonderdraft and you've got it all set up and open it up, you'll be presented with this screen. What you want to do is you want to head over to New, and it will open this little legend, and it's going to allow you to select your theme but also your canvas size. See here that I've got a custom size set up, which would be A3 at 300 pixels per inch, which is the resolution that you want for a map if you're going to print it. But I can also click here and achieve the same result by a few pixels, and I can also choose my theme from down here. Once I've chosen how big I want my map to be, I click OK, and it will generate a canvas. To zoom in and out, you want to hold down Control and use the mouse wheel, and that'll let you get a full picture of your canvas. Now, before I start doing any work on the land in any map that I make in Wonderdraft, I tweak my water settings. So I head up to the top left here and click on water, and then I click on water appearance, and that'll bring up some sliders on the right here to change the hue, the saturation, how light or bright it is, and how much stain there is in the water. I always turn the stain right down because I don't like a really stained looking map. And then I usually will play with the values a little bit and give a little more saturation to the water. I like a nice, colourful and punchy map. One of the biggest things that drew me to Wonderdraft is its feature for generating land masses. The thing that I struggle the most with in map making is creating believable looking coastlines and borders and getting the shape of a map to look right. Whereas in Wonderdraft, if you come over here onto the left and click on the land tab and use this little crystal ball landmass wizard, you can generate all of that without having to do really any work, which is really good if you are a dungeon master who doesn't have a huge amount of artistic talent for drawing maps, or if you don't have time, because dungeon mastering takes up a huge amount of time as it is, and using a tool like this will save you quite a lot of time. So you've got several patterns to choose from here. Uniform will give you kind of a zoomed in map if I generate one like this. So here you can see uniform gives you that zoomed in look of a smaller section of a bigger map. And then you've also got a continent, which will give you an individual island, a continent to base your campaign around. Next you have archipelago, which is an island chain. This is probably the one I use the least because it takes the most amount of work, I think, to look good. Then you have atoll, which generates one of these sort of circular islands. Again, not one that I use super often. And finally, there is world, which gives you several continents over an entire globe. This is the one I use most often, and it's what we'll be starting with today. So you can change the roughness of your coastlines, you can change the amount of detail that there is, and you can also raise and lower the waterline, which impacts how large your world map is. So even if you start out and you don't think the world looks that good, I always suggest changing the water level because it might result in a map that you think looks cool. Like this looks much more interesting than the base generated version that we had. I don't necessarily think that this works for an entire world, but that is a really interesting shape for some islands or a continent to base a campaign around. So we're going to start using that as our basis. So we're just going to zoom in here, and then I'm going to show you how to use some of the land tools. The first one that you have is the Landmass brush. Now this gives you a brush of various sizes that will just paint in a chunk of landmass exactly in the shape of your brush, which is usually a round. You also have the Landmass eraser, which does exactly the same thing and erases exactly what's underneath that round tool. Next, you have the Raise Landmass tool. Now, this is what you want to use if you want to fill in some of your coastlines, and that's because it has a roughness scale. So you can see here, I can place my cursor, which is this circle, near the edge of the land here. And if I start clicking on it, instead of filling the whole thing in, it starts to randomly fill it in and add some roughness to the coastline. So this is a really good way to fill in some detail without just making a circular mass of land that will look really out of place. You can do a similar thing with the lower landmass tool if you want to erase a section of coastline, but also retain some of that jaggedness that will make it look more realistic. You can use the lower landmass tool instead of the eraser because it'll give you a more natural looking finish. And finally, down here in our land tool, we have the ground brush, and you'll use this to paint your land masses into different colors. So you might pick a green and go in and paint your land a green color. The really nice thing about this tool is it is bound to your land layer, so you can't paint over your ocean, which means that you can, if you just want to lay down a lot of color really quickly, you can zoom out, make the brush as big as it can be, and just really quickly paint in a huge section of land. If you want to change the color that you have just made, you can right click on the color option here and change your color. Say if you wanted to brighten it up a little bit, and then you can come in and see what that looks like, and just play with the settings until you find a color that you are happy with. I like that color, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the color erase tool to get rid of all the block color that I've put in so far, and then I'll go through and color a section of this island for us to start adding some detail to. Once you've generated your land, the next thing you might want to do is start adding in some rivers. And Wonderdraft has a really nice river tool to do this. You'll find it in the water tab, and it has settings for how wide you'd like your river, and it also has settings for how rough you want the coastline of the river to be, and also how much you'd like it to meander, how much of a curve you'd like to be put into it. So if I just zoom in here and start out in the ocean, drag my river inland, double click, you can see that it erases a section of the land and gives me a nice river. I can also play with the width of that then, and I can have maybe a small tributary running into that river, and maybe we'd put a mountain or something here. Another tool that you have at your disposal is a lake tool. Now that will generate a random shaped lake that you can pop down onto your map. Now you can play around with the size of your lake here and do exactly the same thing. Give yourself an inland lake. Another thing you can do for your rivers is toggle whether or not you want them to fade in. Now fading in I think works really well when you're making small little streams and rivers to feed into a main one, but if you want to move from a lake to a source, then you probably don't want thinning into the lake, so you turn it off and you can start and just erase a section. Once you've added in your rivers, the next thing that you'll want to do is just tidy them up here and there. If we zoom in here, you can see that this lake has quite jagged edges and there are some small little bits that don't look too good. So we're going to go into our landmass tool and we'll just use the brush, the standard brush, to just fill those areas that we don't like in. And then we'll use our raise landmass tool here to just go in and tidy those edges up a little bit. And that just helps give a little bit of a better definition and make the whole thing look a little nicer. Once we've added some rivers, it's time to start thinking about adding some symbols. And I always like to start with the mountains because I can place them on the sources of the river straight away. So we go into the symbols tab on the left here, click on the mountains symbols, and you can see that in the base version of Wonderdraft that you have several different mountain styles to use. My favorite mountains are these two here, the two penciled mountains. And the reason that I like them is because they take color really nicely. So you also have the option to change the scale of them. And if you hold down your mouse or your tablet pen, you'll place several of them in a row, and you can change what that placement rate is on the right here as well. I tend to place my mountains, my big mountains, individually though, so I have a little more control. So we're just going to adjust the size here and then place a couple of mountains. And you'll see that I've placed them overlapping the river so that we can't see the start of the river, so that we get a sense that the river is starting up in those mountains and flowing down. One of the great things about these inked and penciled mountains, these white ones here on the right, is that they pick up the color from underneath them. So you can go back into your land tool, click on your paintbrush, and then you can color them however you would like. What you can then do is you can go into the filters and you can turn off the ability to color anything except mountains. You can do this for mountains, trees, symbols, or ground. So if we come in here and we just color our mountains, if we then decided we want to change the color around the mountain, change the color of the ground, we just unselect the mountains, select the ground again, and then we could come in and change the ground color without filling in the mountain color itself. So once I've added mountains, the next thing I normally do is work on trees. And again, just like the mountains, you have several different styles and options for your trees in Wonderdraft. You have several black and white versions. You have some colorless versions that you can color in. So if we add some penciled trees, you see they pick up the color behind them, and you can then go in at a later date and add a different color, exactly the same way we did with the mountains, by filtering which symbols you pick up. So what I normally do is I start out by reducing the size of my trees a little bit in relation to the mountain, and I go in and I just drag them around the foothills of the mountain and along river paths, anywhere where I think that a forest might form. And I start by doing this all over the map, covering all of the mountains and all of the major rivers where I think there'll be forests. And then once that is done, then I'll go in and add some smaller hills and smaller mountains in between areas of large mountain range and forest, and then I fill those in with trees as well. One cool thing about the tree option and all of the symbols is the collision scale. You can change how densely packed your symbols go down. So it starts at a default of 1, which looks like this. If I just make that a little larger so you can see it, that's the sort of spacing you get at 1. If I drop it all the way down to 0.25, you can see that everywhere I drag is really dense with tree, and that would be the same for any symbol. If I drag it all the way up to 2, it gives me much looser forest, and so many trees don't stack on top of each other at any one time. So you have quite a lot of control over how sparse or dense you want your forest areas or mountain ranges to be, using that placement rate and collision tool. So if I turn the placement rate right up with collision right up, you can see that when I start, I get a lot of trees. Whereas if I turn them both right the way down, I barely get any trees. And that's good for adding some trees to wide open areas just to fill those areas in and make them look a little more interesting. There are also a whole host of other symbols available in Wonderdraft. Clicking on the little castle icon will bring up your symbols menu, and you can see here that there are cliffs, there are monsters, ships, towns, custom colored icons, which are these basic little icons if you like a more minimalist style map. There are castles and all sorts of different symbols available. One of the real strengths of Wonderdraft is that you can add your own symbols and add community-made assets to give you even more options within the program. If you'd like to do this, you go to the 3 bars at the top left and open your user folder. That will then open your Wonderdraft folder, and you can then click into your assets folder, and you can drop folders in here for different assets. You can see I've already got one here by a user on Reddit who does really amazing work, and once it's added into your folder, you can then go in and go into your sample symbols option, which is where I put all of my custom downloaded symbols so I can keep them separate from the base, and you can see that you can add those there. So I have a couple of options for pyramids and things like that for a different map that I'm working on. But if you go to the Wonderdraft subreddit, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, there is a huge amount of assets already available made by the community, and there are more being added almost every single day. And that's one of the things that I love the most about Wonderdraft, is this community-driven focus that gives you way more options than any one developer could, but allows you to get up and running really quickly. So on our map here, I'm just going to drop in one of the custom symbols just to show you how it looks. And then I might also put another one up here, let's say. Once you've added symbols and locations to your map, you might want to join them together. And you can do this using the Paths tool. You go to the Paths on the left and then click this little quill path icon tool. And you can see that you can draw lines of different styles. And you can also affect how thick they are, their roughness, and what their color is. So I'm just going to change it to white so it's really visible. And then add in a icon for a road between these two areas. Now you can see that there is a natural curve to this line, which you can change with the roughness. And as I slide that up, it makes it more wobbly. And as I lower it down, it makes it straighter. So I like to add a little bit of roughness and then work in small clicks and connect two locations. You can see here that I've chosen to draw over my symbols with my path tool. And if I change my mind about that, all I need to do is go into the paths option and click on this little path select tool, and then select the path in question and click that little checkbox for draw over symbols, and that will force it behind them automatically. If you have symbols that you want to move around, if you go into the symbols tab and click on the selection tool, if you click on any one symbol, so if I click and drag this tree here, I can change the layer that it appears on. So I can move symbols behind or in front of each other with a relative amount of freedom. And I can also select several symbols and do the same, move them behind things or in front of things at will. Once you've added your symbols, the next thing that I like to do is I like to add my labels to label the towns. You do that in the labels tab here on the left, and you click on the label tool. Now you have several preset options for size and coloring. You've got city, town, water, or terrain. So we'll start with a couple of towns, and to add a label you just click anywhere on the map and it will generate a label. One of the really cool things about Wonderdraft is that it already has a name generator built in, which again, if you are a dungeon master or a map maker, a world builder who's really short on time and you want to get something quick, you can use that to generate some names that you might like. So again, we have options here for either settlements or bodies of water. So we'll start with settlements and we'll click this little question mark here until we find a name that looks something like what we'd be looking for in our map. If you couldn't find something in the generator, of course, you can double click on it and change the name there like that. So we'll start with Ironloft and zoom out a little here. One thing to bear in mind is that if you start with a really large canvas, like this particular canvas would be A3 size when printed, but if you zoom in, everything looks jagged and pixelated, which of course it does because it is blown up much larger than it would be in real life. So I always recommend changing your zoom level just to get a better idea of how it would look, and I just zoom out until it fills the screen, because I know that my screen is the area I'm working in will be around A3 in size, so I can see that this is a little small. So all I need to do is go back in and just increase the font size to maybe 30, just so that it is a little more distinct when it's being viewed from a distance. Another option you have in your label tab is to add boxes. This is really good for adding a key or a legend to your map or adding a title. We can draw a box in one of several styles. So we click on it and then we can change the style to be something that we like. And then we can go back in and use our text tool with our preset maybe for terrain and change that to 120, and we might call it YouTube Land. So that just gives you a little bit of embellishment that you can do right at the end to add a name for your map or a key just to show what some things on your map are. Another thing that you might want to do at the end of the process is add in a compass. So we'd go to the symbols option, choose compass roses, and find one that suits you. You can, of course, change the coloring of these compasses to suit your style, and you can also increase the scale. So we could pop a compass there. And that's just another really nice little option for you to add some finishing touches to your map. Once you've finished your map, one thing that you're probably going to want to do, especially if you are a dungeon master, is add a grid so that you can get a sense of the distances on your map. To do this, just go into the overlay tab, click on the grid tool option, and then you've got a few choices for pattern. You can choose square, flat hex, or pointed hex. So we're going to go with flat hex today. And you can see that immediately puts in a grid of hexagons onto your map. You can then use these options on the right here to change the color of the grid, to change the size of the grid, and to change the line width. So we're just going to zoom in here and we're just going to very slowly start creeping the size down. One thing that is still an issue in Wonderdraft at the moment is if you change this size too rapidly, the program is prone to crashing because of the amount of hexagons or squares that it puts on the screen at once. So if you're doing this, make sure to save before putting your grid on and then change the size very slowly. Once you've added a grid, you'll probably want to add a scale to it, and you can do that in the overlay tab using the scale creation tool. Just choose one of your grid boxes or hexagons and then use this on the right to add in information. So you can change the segment distance, you can change which numbers you want to display, whether you want to do every other number only the ending numbers, only the start, no numbers. You can change the font size, the color of the scale, and also how large it is. So what I normally do is I'll change my segment distance to 25 and then just click create. And you can see over here it's created a scale, and then I'll just drag this over one of the hexes to get an idea of whether it's the right size or not, which it isn't. So we just make our segment size a little bit bigger. So we'll try 500, which is too big. So we'll try 400, which is around the right size for what we're doing here today. This works much better on a square grid, of course, because all of the edges are the same size, but it allows you to drop in a scale on your map so that you know how large each portion, each part of the grid is, which makes it really useful for when you're calculating distance that your party might need to travel. If you know that each one of these hexes is a 25-mile block, you know that they can travel in up to 1 hex a day. Once you're all finished with your map and you are ready to export it, you'll want to decide whether or not to include your grid. If you decide that you don't want to include your grid, just go to your grid tool and change the opacity of the grid here. So you can make it really bold, or you can turn it all the way off. The grid stays there so that if you want to come back and do 2 versions, one gridded and one without, you can do that. And then you head up here to export and decide what kind of image that you want, whether you want normal or a height map. For 90% of you out there who are just making maps for D&D, normal will be fine. You click that and it will ask you where you want to save it. You just give it a name and choose what type of file you want it to be. I always stick with the default PNG, and then I do a little bit of after editing in Photoshop, and just give it a name for your file and click save, and it will export your map out and you'll be left with a lovely image. The larger your map, the longer it will take to export, so just leave it to do its thing and don't try and mess with it because it could cause the program to crash. But once it's exported, then you are all done. But one of the biggest features in version 1 of Wonderdraft, one of the things that I am most excited about, is there's a new option for creating zoomed in maps of a region within the program itself. So if I just open up a map that I have already made, this is a map for the nation of Ash, which I have made as part of my ongoing homebrew campaign series, which you can find a link to in the description below or up in the card. So, for example, I might want to make a more zoomed in version of this section of the map that has been bordered off. To do that, I will go up to the menu tool, the 3 lines at the top left, and then create detailed map. That brings up a new wizard where you decide on your zoom level. I think the default 4x zoom is just fine. And you also decide what you want to include. So if you choose to include symbols, it will drag the mountains and the trees in at 4 times their original size. This will usually make them look pretty bad because they've been blown up bigger than they normally would. So what I normally do is I disable symbols, trees, mountains, and labels, and I just re-add them on the new map. I leave paths because for this particular example, I want to keep that pathway so I can show this border area. So I go then and I select my area, being sure to capture that whole path, and I'll click create. And it'll take a few moments to make the new map. So you can see here that it's dragged it all into a new map and kept the outline of the coast, kept the rivers, and kept the colouring of the ground. This is really useful to give you the option to create a world map, so a big wide world map, and then zoom in so that you have a smaller region. If you do this before you start a campaign, you can create the whole world or the whole country at least just the outline of it, then you can use this tool to create a zoomed in section for the map that you hand your players initially. So it gives you a lot of flexibility so that you don't have to create whole new maps from scratch and match the coastlines and worry about importing things and using tracing tools. You can just click on an area of your map, zoom right into a new map. It's a really, really handy tool as a Dungeon Master to create a variety of maps from one. So there we have it, a really basic overview on how to use the different tools in Wonderdraft. If you want to see how to do things more in depth, how to use the program to make good looking maps, you can check out my how to make maps with Wonderdraft video, which I'll link below and in the card. And you can also check out the video that I did on making the map for Ashk as part of my homebrew campaign series. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like because it really helps us out. And if you're new here and like what you see on the channel and you want to see more RPG content, more map making content, more content for world builders and dungeon masters, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. But until next time, happy gaming. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for new content every single Friday. And if you want to keep watching, well, there's another couple videos for you to watch just over there. Happy gaming.